If you listen to this show regularly, and there are a lot more of you doing that now, I'm delighted to say, thank you for that. If you listen regularly, you will know that we have been talking a lot about legal aid and have done it for some time, primarily as a response to a case involving the family of Zain Bangbola, who's a 7-year-old boy who died in the flooding in 2014 in Surrey. And you will know that in taking on state-funded lawyers at his inquest, his parents were turned down for legal aid of £70,000 to help fight those lawyers that you and I are paying for anyway. They were turned down and told that it wasn't in the public interest. They were then forced to do their own legal work, despite no legal training, or crowdfund to raise the money to pay for a legal team. And in the end, they were able to do that thanks to a mystery donation of about £20,000, and they managed to pay for legal representation at that inquest through donations. But that is a state of affairs that I don't believe should exist. And part of the principle of justice is having equality of arms, that deep pockets should have no bearing on your ability to battle in the courts. Rich, poor, whatever you are, you start from the same place, and the race is run from there. That is the principle, and yet it doesn't seem to be happening. And there is another example of it today. The grandfather of murdered Ellie Butler hit out last night at the injustice that allowed his daughter's killer to be awarded £2 million in legal aid. Ellie Butler's dad, who was found guilty of her murder, was given £1.4 million in legal aid payments over 15 years to help fight for custody of Ellie, and then in the courts against his murder charge. Neil Gray, who is Ellie's granddad, who took charge of her for several periods during her life, who was also fighting for custody when she was given back to her father and mother, her father who ultimately murdered her. He received nothing in legal aid because he says they were not on benefits. Because they had some savings, £80,000 in savings, they were able to pay, but in doing so, it bankrupted them. And Neil said, quote, "I'm sure the ordeal killed my wife and now I don't have her or Ellie." He said, "We spent our entire life savings and took 2 extra cleaning jobs to fight for Ellie. It was incredibly hard, and all we wanted to do was to look after our granddaughter. We were willing to do anything to get her back. We fought tooth and nail, but it wasn't an even playing field. We ran out of money and ended up not being represented in the case. It makes me very angry. It's just unbelievable," he says, which is heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking. The Mail says the extraordinary payments will fuel the simmering row over the government's decision to severely water down its reform of the legal aid system. Ministers boasted how the budget had been cut from £2.4 billion to £1.6 billion, but suspended further cuts and changes earlier this year. And critics accusing them of being cowed, it says, from the most controversial changes by a vociferous legal lobby and series of complex court challenges. How is it anything approaching justice that the moment you lose the ability to pay is the moment your chances of justice seem to go? And what makes me cross is not that legal aid is given to people who fight cases and lose because they're guilty and they're child murderers, because the minute you say they shouldn't be getting money to help pay for their legal costs is the minute you deny people like Neil Gray the opportunity to do the same. There has to be legal aid given to sides who need it, regardless of the outcome of the court's decision, but there have to be better rules on access to it. And I'm not saying there should be a blank cheque available to people, but where people are taking on the state in the courts and where it's clear they don't have the funds the state has to fund the legal battle, surely more should be done to support people like Neil Gray and his wife who are fighting for custody of their granddaughter. 0345 6060 973. Let me bring you the response briefly of the Ministry of Justice, who responded to the Mail's request for those statistics on costs. They did a Freedom of Information request. They said the legal aid is only available to those who cannot afford to pay their own fees. They said, although there are merits of the case tests in civil legal aid cases, parents in care proceedings are exempt. Legal aid is now only available for the highest priority cases, which include care proceedings. They said the government has taken action to reduce legal aid expenditure. It has been reduced by 20% since 2010. 0345 6060 973. How is a system allowed to prevail where a man who has £80,000 in savings, who can afford to pay some of his legal costs, isn't given legal aid, whereas the person on benefits is given legal aid in order to fight that challenge and is given legal aid throughout the entire proceedings, which enables them to pay for it, whereas the other guy goes bust and can't fight anymore? 0345 6060 973. 3. 9 minutes past 2 is the time. Let's speak to someone who knows a lot more about this than I do. Joseph Kotrie-Monson is director of Mary Monson Solicitors on Fleet Street, who specialise in serious criminal cases. Afternoon to you, Joseph.
Good afternoon, Tom.
Tell me about what you take from this story about the family of Ellie Butler and the money that was given to her parents to fight this case.
Well, Tom, I mean, we have a tremendously sad, disturbing, and you've quite rightly identified, infuriating case, which highlights some of the worst inequalities of our justice system. I'm also, Tom, without trying to blow your own trumpet too much, very encouraged to hear that you clearly have identified that there's a sense of the argument being manipulated in the way it's presented in the Daily Mail, for example, today, to show somehow that legal aid is a bad thing,
yes,
rather than not giving it.
Yeah.
Let's go to the first point, and just for a bit of narrative and background as to the way in which legal aid was granted in this case. The foster parents of this poor girl, Ellie Butler, looked after her when her father, Ben, was convicted and sent to prison for assaulting her. His conviction was then quashed on appeal, and he launched that campaign that you've just talked about to get her back in the courts. Of course, he was funded by legal aid. Of course, at that point, in the eyes of the law, if we had been talking about the case at that point, he would have been an innocent man, and we wouldn't necessarily have been talking. We would have probably said he should have had that legal aid. There's nothing in the reporting that suggests that his partner was applying for joint custody. That is, however, an assumption that I've made, and it could be wrong. She, of course, got legal aid too. It's not the case that he got the legal aid himself. And of course, legal aid went to lawyers, didn't go into his pocket, and for him to pay them. It's a small distinction, but it's one that's been misrepresented in all the articles today. Now, the grandparents, for one of two reasons, did not qualify for legal aid in proceedings. Not absolutely clear from the reporting why. The grandfather seems to say that it was on the basis of means. That's, again, an assumption I've made that that's correct.
Yeah.
The fact that they expended £80,000 on representation may imply that they were at least in some position to pay at the outset. But if the position changes, one can reapply once your financial position changes. That's my understanding.
Right.
Of course, it's getting harder and harder and harder to get legal aid in the first place. And of course, they weren't parents, which would have meant they were in a slightly different category to parents with regard to getting legal aid.
And this is where the difficulty arises, because as you point out that the argument is not against legal aid and the handing out. The argument is against the tests.
Well, that's our
decide.
argument,
yeah.
But it's not the way the argument's being used by fairly cheeky and I must say, on the basis of today, disreputable writers.
Interesting. I'll leave those comments with you.
Yeah, you must.
But anybody who's making those decisions must have an understanding of what it costs to go through the court. And just by way of comparison, Jenny Gray, who was ultimately convicted of child abuse and who was involved in trying to essentially cover up her daughter's murder, her legal bills through the family court case for custody of Ellie was £223,266,
yeah,
which is a lot more than 80.
No, absolutely, and the reality is £80,000 never would have made it in this case, and that sounds to anyone who earns a normal amount of money like you and me, sounds
ridiculous.
Like a huge amount of money. And you imagine, well, one lawyer, and it probably took him a few months. Why should that lawyer earn £200,000? Of course, it's not like that. These proceedings last year's. These proceedings involve teams of lawyers, loads of hearings, much more care even than criminal proceedings, because they have update hearings as they go. There are negotiation hearings. The finding of fact hearings are extensive. And you don't just have the child's being represented by CAFCAS, you have the local authority, you have the father, the grandparents, and the mother, nearly always being separately represented. And you can imagine when each one of those has to say something in court on a specific point, the proceedings are just huge. There's just a massive amount of labour. It should also be added, in the defence of these lawyers, there are many family lawyers now who, despite what we would think are great fees, but of course, there's huge amounts of work that goes behind them, huge amounts of resources, not just from lawyers, but from admin staff. But there are many family lawyers who've had to desert family law and in legal aid family law, and now will only act privately because the private market pays so much better. I'm not saying for a minute that means that these people are somehow in poverty when they're doing it. As a criminal lawyer, in our firm, we can't afford to do as many legal aid cases as we would like. We have to subsidise them in reality with private cases, limit the amount of legal aid cases we take, because if we did all the legal aid cases that the government would like us to take on at the rates they'd pay, the only way to do them properly would either to be them to do them at an unethically low rate, or to make a loss, and neither of those would be acceptable.
So it sounds like the solution is going to have to involve spending more money on this, which is, of course, arguably not an option in the economic times we live in at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting into a philosophical a philosophical argument about exactly what kind of economic situation this country is in now, and and whether we're really as skint as the as recent governments. As especially Osborne, Cameron have told us we are in terms of spending, and whether they're on some kind of ideological push to reduce the size of the state. The point is here, we don't vote for governments that back legal aid because we don't think it'll ever happen to us. We don't think our cousin or our nephew will ever be accused of rape, and when it does happen, perhaps people can imagine that a bit more than happening to themselves, or that we'll have a messy divorce, or something crazy will happen that will mean we might not get access to our kids. And if God forbid it happens to us, or if we hear a terrible story like this, Tom, aren't we sometimes guilty of conveniently not making the connection between that and these governments that we've been voting for the past 15 years, and these policies they sold us? And I've got to say, the lies in the tabloid and some broadsheet press about legal aid fat cats, about the fact that the system's out of control, we've got the most expensive system in Europe, again a lie, and the idea that somehow that by pointing to examples of bad people who got legal aid, it means we spend too much on the legal aid system and nobody should get it. The logic there is confounding. And, I just ask people to just think a little bit more about this issue before, in the way that we've been doing today, and I'm sure people listening to it from this perspective are, when a government's next talking to them about fat cat lawyers and scumbags who are rinsing the system and all of that type of stuff. Most legal aid lawyers are fairly idealistic. They're in it for the right reasons, to help people. You can't choose whether you help just the good people and not the bad people. You're doing it because you believe in what that guy talked about at the beginning of your piece, an even playing field. It's not just about making sure that the bad guys don't get the money. It's about making sure that everybody gets a fair shout.
Joseph, great to talk to you this afternoon. Thank you for your time. Joseph Kotrie-Monson, Director of Mary Monson Solicitors on Fleet Street, who specialise in serious criminal cases. And I'm afraid if you view this story and you get angry about, God, £2 million spent on this bloke who turned out and was convicted of being a child murderer, if the £2 million makes you angry, then I'm afraid how do you then explain to the grandfather who was made bankrupt by this, how would you explain that he should get access to this money and they shouldn't, bearing in mind that we start from the principle of innocent until proven otherwise?